At first glance, it's just another yearbook photo. The kind that gets tucked away in attics, sandwiched between pages of smiling teenagers who once thought their whole lives would fit inside the walls of a high school. But this one is different. It's 1972, a small square of glossy paper from the Pegasus yearbook at Homestead High School in Cupertino, California. In the photo, a young man sits upright, wearing a bow tie that feels both traditional and slightly ironic, his long hair brushing his collar. His gaze is direct, steady, with just a hint of something else, a spark, a question, a restless intelligence that seems to lean forward, even in stillness. His name, Stephen Paul Jobs. Age, 17. Future, unknown. We know him now as the co-founder of Apple, the man whose vision put 1,000 songs in your pocket, whose devices changed the way you connect, work, think, and even feel. We know the black turtleneck, the stage presentations, the headlines. But here, in this frozen moment, there is no Apple, no iPhone, no Macintosh, just a boy, a camera flash, and the quiet hum of a California afternoon. If you could step inside this photo, you wouldn't hear the sound of applause or the clicking of keyboards in Cupertino offices. You'd hear the faint squeak of sneakers in school hallways, the clatter of lunch trays, the crackle of vinyl from a bedroom record player. You'd see textbooks with worn edges, doodles in the margins, the mechanical whir of a film projector in history class. And you'd see Steve Jobs, not as a global icon, but as a teenager balancing between worlds. Part dreamer, part misfit, part something else entirely. That's the thing about yearbook photos. They pretend to be final snapshots of who we were, but in reality, they are unfinished portraits of who we might become. Jobs himself might have thought of this photo as just another obligatory ritual, a box to check before graduation. Smile, pose, move along. But if you look closely, there's an intensity in his eyes, as if he already knew the world he saw around him wasn't enough. In 1972, Silicon Valley wasn't yet the polished tech capital we imagine today. It was still orchards and modest suburbs, a place where kids rode their bikes through neighborhoods dotted with garages that would, in a few short years, become the launch pads of a technological revolution. Jobs didn't look like the revolution. Not yet. He looked like a boy who read as much as he skipped class, who questioned authority as naturally as he breathed, who didn't quite fit the mold of the all-American student. And maybe that was the first sign. Friends from those days recall how Steve was never content with small talk. He wanted to know what you thought about things that mattered. Not just the latest song on the radio, though he cared deeply about music, but why you liked it, what it said about the world, about you. He was curious in a way that wasn't always comfortable. Teachers found him bright but defiant. He would challenge assignments, question grading systems, and sometimes flat-out refuse to do work he thought was meaningless. In the world of 1970s high school, that wasn't a recipe for straight A's. But it was a recipe for something else, an independent mind. There's a certain irony in looking at this young Steve Jobs and knowing what's to come. In this photo, he's years away from founding Apple with Steve Wozniak in a garage. Years away from dropping out of Reed College. Years away from the triumphs and failures that would define his public life. The Macintosh launch, the exile from Apple, the return that would transform the company into one of the most valuable in history. But in this picture, all of that is compressed into a single point in time. The before picture to one of the most famous after stories of the modern age. Imagine being able to walk down that high school hallway in 1972, past lockers and classrooms, and see this boy without knowing what he would become. Would you notice anything different? Would you sense that you were looking at someone who would reshape entire industries? Or would you see just another teenager, restless, maybe a little arrogant, maybe a little bored, trying to figure out where he belonged? That's the beauty of moments like this. They hide greatness in plain sight. And maybe that's why this photograph feels electric when you really stop to look at it. It's a reminder that every legend begins somewhere ordinary. But Jobs' ordinary was already quietly extraordinary. At 17, he had a knack for getting into places he wasn't supposed to be, from sneaking into classes at Stanford just to listen, to exploring the Palo Alto electronics stores where the future of computing was being quietly assembled in circuit boards and solder fumes. Even then, he was drawn to the edges of things. The boundary between art and engineering. The space where aesthetics met function. The place where something could be beautiful and useful at the same time. You don't see that in the photo, not directly. But you feel it, in the set of his mouth, in the way he looks directly into the lens. Not smiling wide, not playing to the audience, but meeting it. It's the look of someone who knows he doesn't quite belong to the world as it is, and is already wondering how to build the world as it could be. That's where our story begins. Not in the garage, not on the Apple stage, not in a product launch seen by millions, but here, in a high school yearbook, where a boy named Steve Jobs sat for a photograph that, in hindsight, feels less like a school tradition and more like the opening frame of a film we've all been watching ever since. Because in this still image, something stirs, and it's about to change everything. To understand the boy in the 1972 yearbook photo, you have to step outside the frame. Beyond the neat bow tie and the quiet gaze, there's a world that's shaping him. A unique mix of suburban comfort, technological possibility, and cultural rebellion that only California in the early 70s could offer. Steve Jobs didn't grow up in just any neighborhood. He grew up in the heart of what would soon be called Silicon Valley. Though back then, it was still a patchwork of orchards, small homes, and the hum of aerospace and electronics companies quietly changing the future. His adoptive parents, Paul and Clara Jobs, gave him something rare: stability. Paul was a machinist and a craftsman, a man who could take apart an engine and put it back together better than before. Clara was warm, steady, the kind of mother who kept the household grounded. Paul Jobs wasn't a computer engineer, but in the garage of their modest home, he taught Steve something that would matter far more than any textbook: respect for craftsmanship. If you're going to build something, Paul told him, build it right. Make the back of the cabinet as beautiful as the front, even if no one will ever see it. It was a lesson about pride in your work, about the invisible details. A lesson that would come back years later when Jobs would obsess over the inside of Apple's circuit boards, insisting they be beautiful, even though customers would never open their computers. But the California of Steve's youth wasn't just about clean garages and good craftsmanship. It was also about experimentation. By the late 60s and early 70s, the counterculture was in full bloom. San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury was a short drive away. The music of Bob Dylan, the Beatles, and the Grateful Dead wasn't just background noise. It was a philosophy. Ideas about self-expression, questioning authority, and breaking the mold weren't radical here. They were everywhere. Steve was caught between these two worlds. One, the precise, measured discipline of his father's workshop. The other, the wild, chaotic energy of a generation refusing to play by the old rules. It's no wonder that the young Jobs didn't fit neatly into one box. He wasn't the straight-laced future engineer his neighbors might have expected, but he also wasn't content to drift without purpose. He was searching. That search took him into the orbit of electronics long before most kids even thought about computers. Down the street from the Jobs home was Hewlett-Packard, one of the earliest tech giants. In an era when security was far looser, curious teenagers could wander into company lectures or poke around with equipment at school-sponsored programs. Jobs wasn't afraid to take advantage. In fact, when he needed a specific part for a school project, he looked up Bill Hewlett himself, co-founder of Hewlett-Packard, and called him at home. It was a bold move, the kind that hinted at the fearlessness, and sometimes shamelessness, that would define his career. Hewlett not only answered the phone, he gave Jobs the parts and offered him a summer job. That job exposed Steve to a world where innovation wasn't just a dream, it was a daily practice. Rows of engineers working on cutting-edge electronics, ideas being tested in real time, prototypes taking shape in labs. It was intoxicating for a teenager with an appetite for the new. But there was something else brewing in the background, something more personal. Steve Jobs wasn't content to follow instructions. He wanted to understand why things worked. He wanted to tinker, to bend the rules, to see if he could make something do what it wasn't designed to do. And this is where another key figure enters the story, Stephen Wozniak. Woz was older, more technically skilled, and shared Jobs' curiosity. But he had something Jobs didn't: deep engineering expertise. When the two met, it wasn't an immediate business partnership. It was two young minds feeding off each other's energy, delighting in the possibilities of technology. They didn't just build things, they hacked them. In one famous early project, they created blue boxes, devices that allowed people to make free long-distance calls by mimicking the tones used by the phone system. It was a small taste of the power of combining clever engineering with audacious ambition. Later, Jobs would say that without the blue boxes, there would have been no Apple. Not because of the money they made, but because they proved that with a little ingenuity, they could create something that changed the rules entirely. In 1972, though, that was still in the future. Jobs was still in high school, still wearing that bow tie in his yearbook photo, still walking the fine line between the safety of suburban life and the lure of something much bigger. He would soon graduate, and with that, the boundaries of his world would expand. But even then, the seeds were already planted, a respect for design and detail from his father, a fascination with electronics from the valley around him, a hunger for new ideas from the counterculture that thrived just miles away, and a partnership with a kindred spirit who shared his appetite for invention. All of it was already there, simmering under the surface. If you could freeze that moment in 1972 and look at Jobs walking down the street, you might still see an ordinary teenager. But inside, he was already piecing together the puzzle that would become his life's work. And that puzzle was about to take him somewhere unexpected. To college, yes, but also into a kind of education that had nothing to do with lecture halls and everything to do with finding what truly mattered to him. Because Steve Jobs was about to learn that sometimes the most important lessons come from what you choose not to do. In the fall of 1972, Steve Jobs left Cupertino for Portland, Oregon, to attend Reed College, a small, prestigious liberal arts school known for attracting free thinkers, artists, and intellectual rebels. On paper, it seemed like the perfect match. Here was a place where individuality wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated, where you could spend hours debating philosophy in a coffee house and no one would think you were wasting your time. But within months, Jobs began to realize something. This traditional path wasn't for him. It wasn't that he hated learning. In fact, Jobs loved ideas, loved exploring them deeply, but he couldn't stomach the structure. The idea that you had to follow a rigid curriculum, take courses you had no interest in, and pay an enormous sum for the privilege. The numbers didn't make sense to him. His tuition was draining his parents' life savings. And for what? To sit in classes that bored him, chasing a degree he didn't believe would define his future. So, in a decision that would horrify most parents, Jobs dropped out. But here's the twist. Dropping out didn't mean leaving. Jobs decided to drop in to the classes that interested him, the ones he wasn't officially enrolled in but could attend for free. This freed him from the courses he didn't care about and gave him space to explore the ones that spoke to his curiosity. One of those classes would change everything. It was a calligraphy course taught by a professor who saw letter forms not just as symbols, but as art. Jobs was fascinated. He learned about serif and sans serif typefaces, about the spacing between letters, about how typography could convey emotion as powerfully as words themselves. At the time, it had no practical application in his life. He wasn't an artist, and he certainly wasn't designing computers. But he was absorbing a principle that would become one of his trademarks. Design matters. Not just how something works, but how it feels. Not just function, but form. Years later, when he and his team created the first Macintosh, those lessons from calligraphy would resurface. The Mac would be the first computer to offer beautiful fonts and elegant typography, a feature so intuitive and natural to us now, but revolutionary at the time. Jobs would later say, "If I had never dropped in on that single calligraphy course in college, the Mac would have never had multiple typefaces or proportionally spaced fonts." But Reed wasn't just shaping Jobs' eye for beauty. It was also deepening his philosophical and spiritual hunger. Jobs immersed himself in books about Zen Buddhism, Hinduism, and meditation. He experimented with diets, fasting, and mind-expanding experiences. He sought meaning not in textbooks, but in experiences, often unconventional ones. He spent nights sleeping on the floors of friends' dorm rooms, returned Coke bottles for spare change, and walked miles across town every Sunday for a free meal at the local Hare Krishna temple. It wasn't comfortable, but it was deliberate. Jobs was stripping away what he saw as unnecessary, trying to get to the essence of things. For most people, dropping out might have been a failure. For Jobs, it was an opening. The decision freed him to follow his instincts, to chase what caught his imagination, to connect dots that wouldn't make sense until much later. In the same way that his father had taught him to make the back of a cabinet as beautiful as the front, Reed was teaching him, in its own unconventional way, to see the hidden architecture of the world, the details that no one else might notice, but that could change everything when you did. By the mid-1970s, Jobs had transformed from the bow-tied teenager of the yearbook photo into a barefoot, turtleneck-wearing seeker of meaning. He wasn't yet the CEO. He wasn't yet the entrepreneur. But the foundations were being poured. And then another shift came. One that would pull him out of Portland and back to California, and toward the garage where history would begin. In the next chapter of our story, the quiet searching would give way to something far louder: invention. Because Steve Jobs was about to meet his moment. If the first 3 chapters of Steve Jobs' life were about gathering the pieces, this one was about putting them together. The story really begins in the unlikely friendship between Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. They met in 1971 when Jobs was still in high school and Wozniak was in college. Woz was older, shy, and a certified engineering genius. Jobs was younger, charismatic, and had an uncanny sense of where technology could go and how people might fall in love with it. They didn't have much in common socially, but intellectually, they clicked. It was as if one could see the machinery and the other could see the future it could create. Their first big collaboration wasn't a computer at all. It was the Blue Box, a small device that could mimic the tones used by telephone companies to route calls, allowing free long-distance calls. The Blue Box wasn't legal, but it was ingenious. Wozniak built it, Jobs sold it, and together they proved something critical. They could take an idea from a spark in their minds to a tangible product that worked, and they could do it better than anyone else they knew. Jobs would later say, "If it hadn't been for the Blue Boxes, there would have been no Apple." Not because of the money they made, but because it gave them a taste of what was possible when they combined their talents. Fast forward to 1976. Wozniak had been working at Hewlett-Packard. In his spare time, he began designing a personal computer, a radical idea at a time when computers were giant, expensive machines locked away in corporate or university labs. Woz's design was small, affordable, and could be built with off-the-shelf parts. It wasn't sleek, but it worked beautifully. Jobs saw more than a hobby project. He saw a revolution. This was the beginning of Apple Computer. Jobs convinced Wozniak to sell the idea, to turn it into a product that anyone, not just engineers, could own and use. They had no funding, no office, and no factory. What they did have was a garage at Jobs' family home in Los Altos. It was in that garage. With a workbench, a few tools, and boundless ambition, that Apple's first computer, the Apple I, was born. Jobs handled the business side, finding parts, negotiating deals, convincing local electronics stores to carry their machine. Wozniak handled the engineering, pouring his brilliance into the circuitry. The division of labor was clear. Woz built, Jobs sold, but it was more than that. Jobs shaped the vision, insisting the product wasn't just about performance, but about presentation, about making the technology inviting. The first big break came from a man named Paul Terrell, owner of the Byte Shop, one of the first computer stores in the world. Terrell agreed to buy 50 Apple I units, but only if they came fully assembled. This was a turning point. Until then, most personal computers were sold as kits you had to solder together yourself. Jobs seized the opportunity. If they could deliver a ready-to-use machine, they could open the market to people who loved technology but weren't hobbyists. To fill the order, Jobs sold his Volkswagen van, Wozniak sold his HP calculator, and they used the money to buy the parts they needed. The Apple I wasn't glamorous. It was essentially a motherboard without a case. You had to supply your own keyboard and monitor. But it was a start. More importantly, it was a proof of concept. They could design, build, and sell a product that ordinary people wanted. Jobs was already thinking beyond the Apple I. He wanted a computer that was self-contained, beautifully designed, and friendly to the average user. This vision would lead to the Apple II, a machine that didn't just appeal to hobbyists. It exploded into the mainstream. The Apple II launched in 1977, and it was everything Jobs had imagined. Colorful graphics, a sleek case, and a keyboard built right in. It was the first personal computer that felt like it belonged in your home, not in a lab. It was a runaway success. Schools began adopting it, families bought it, and the name Apple started becoming synonymous with personal computing. But success brought its own challenges. Jobs was still in his early 20s, navigating a rapidly growing company, dealing with investors, and learning, sometimes painfully, how to lead. If the boy in the 1972 yearbook photo could have seen himself just 5 years later, running a company, shaping an industry, and redefining what a computer could be, he might have smiled that same quiet, knowing smile. But he wouldn't have been satisfied. Because for Jobs, success was never the end of the story. It was just the start of the next chapter. And the next chapter would take him, and Apple, into uncharted territory. By the early 1980s, Apple was riding high. The Apple II had cemented its place as one of the most successful personal computers in the world. Revenues were soaring, and the company had gone public, making Jobs a multi-millionaire before he turned 30. But for Steve Jobs, the Apple II was already old news. He wasn't interested in resting on past victories. He wanted something new, something that would change not just the market, but the way people thought about computers altogether. That something was the Macintosh. In the late 70s, Jobs had seen a prototype at Xerox's Palo Alto Research Center, a computer with a graphical user interface and a mouse. At the time, most computers required users to type complex commands into a terminal. Xerox's interface was different: windows, icons, and menus that you could click on. Jobs immediately saw the future. The vision was bold: a computer so intuitive, so beautiful, that ordinary people, not just engineers, could use it. Jobs called it the computer for the rest of us. The Macintosh would have a friendly design that invited curiosity, elegant typography, thanks to those calligraphy lessons at Reed, a compact form factor with everything built into one unit. And it wouldn't just work well, it would delight. But building the Mac wasn't just about engineering. It was about culture. Jobs handpicked a small team and told them they were creating a revolution. He pushed them relentlessly, often beyond their limits. Deadlines were tight, standards were sky-high, and Jobs had a knack for demanding the impossible. He inspired, yes, but he also intimidated. His reality distortion field, as team members called it, could make people believe they could achieve anything, but it could also burn them out. When the Macintosh launched in January 1984, Apple didn't just introduce a product, they staged a cultural moment. The 1984 Super Bowl commercial, directed by Ridley Scott, became one of the most famous ads in history. It depicted a gray, oppressive future, an allusion to George Orwell's novel, shattered by a lone heroine hurling a hammer into a massive screen. The message was clear. Apple was here to challenge the status quo, to break the control of the computing big brother, IBM. The Mac itself was stunning. It had a crisp, graphical interface, a built-in screen, and software that made computing feel human. But it also had problems. The hardware was expensive, and its memory was limited. While it dazzled the press and early adopters, it struggled to gain a foothold in the broader business market, where IBM-compatible machines dominated. Inside Apple, tensions began to mount. Jobs' management style, while brilliant in bursts, was clashing with other executives. Some saw him as a visionary, others saw him as reckless. The breaking point came in 1985. Apple's board, concerned about the company's performance and Jobs' volatile leadership, sided with then CEO John Sculley in a power struggle. Jobs was stripped of responsibility for the Macintosh team. It was, in essence, an exile from the company he had built. Imagine that. One day, you're the face of a revolution. The next, you're a guest in your own house. Or worse, shown the door. Jobs was 30 years old. He had wealth, fame, and influence, and yet, in the most important arena of his life, he had just lost. Most people might have taken the hint. Retired early, bought an island, disappeared. But Steve Jobs wasn't most people. His departure from Apple wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would test him, humble him, and ultimately prepare him for the greatest comeback in business history. And while Apple moved on without him, Jobs was already sketching out his next act. In 1985, Steve Jobs walked out of Apple headquarters no longer in charge, no longer the visionary leader of the company he had co-founded in his parents' garage. To the outside world, this looked like a fall from grace, a public defeat. To Jobs, it was something else entirely, freedom. He now had time. He had resources. And he had something far more dangerous than either: unfinished business. Jobs wasn't ready to fade away. If Apple didn't want him steering their future, he would build a new one from scratch. That future began with Next Incorporated, a new computer company founded in 1985 with the goal of creating a machine unlike anything on the market. The next computer would be elegant, powerful, and aimed at the high-end education and business markets. Jobs poured himself into its design, obsessing over every detail, from the magnesium casing to the interface's typography. The machine was beautiful. It was also expensive. At $6,500 in the late 80s, it was out of reach for most buyers. Sales were modest, and Next struggled to find its place in a crowded market. But behind the scenes, something important was happening. Next was developing software and design principles that were years ahead of their time. The operating system they built would later form the foundation of macOS, the heart of modern Apple computers. While Next kept him busy, another opportunity came knocking, one that seemed unrelated to computers at all. In 1986, Jobs purchased a small computer graphics division from George Lucas Lucasfilm for $10 million. The company was called Pixar. At the time, Pixar was focused on high-end graphics hardware, selling to specialized industries. But Jobs soon realized the real magic wasn't in the hardware. It was in the team of animators and storytellers experimenting with fully computer-generated films. Pixar was bleeding money at first, but Jobs believed in the vision. He bankrolled the company year after year, even when there was no guarantee of a return. Then, in 1995, everything changed. Pixar released Toy Story, the first fully computer-animated feature film in history. It wasn't just a hit. It was a phenomenon. Toy Story grossed over $350 million worldwide, won critical acclaim, and cemented Pixar as a powerhouse in both technology and storytelling. Jobs now found himself in a rare position. He was at the helm of not one, but two cutting-edge companies, Next in computing and Pixar in entertainment. But while Pixar soared, Next remained a niche player. It might have stayed that way forever if not for a twist of fate. Apple needed help. By the mid-1990s, Apple was struggling. The company had lost its innovative edge, was bleeding money, and faced the possibility of collapse. In 1996, Apple made a bold move. They bought Next for $429 million. With that acquisition came Steve Jobs. At first, Jobs returned as an advisor. But within months, it was clear who was steering the ship. By 1997, Jobs was interim CEO. And just like that, the man who had been forced out 12 years earlier was back in charge. This wasn't just a comeback. It was a resurrection. Apple was on the brink of irrelevance. Jobs was about to pull it back and turn it into the most valuable company in the world. When Steve Jobs re-entered Apple in 1997, the company was in chaos. Its product line was bloated with dozens of models that confused customers. Sales were falling. The brand that once stood for creativity and innovation had lost its identity. Some analysts were predicting Apple's death within a year. Jobs didn't see a corpse. He saw a patient in critical condition. And he was ready to perform emergency surgery. The first thing Jobs did was simplify. He famously drew a simple 2x2 grid on a whiteboard. Consumer desktop, consumer portable, professional desktop, professional portable, that was it. For products, everything else, gone. It was ruthless, but necessary. By focusing resources on a few great products instead of dozens of mediocre ones, Apple could regain its clarity and purpose. Then came the partnership that shocked the world. At the 1997 Macworld Expo, Jobs announced that Apple was partnering with Microsoft, a company many Apple fans saw as the enemy. Bill Gates appeared via satellite, smiling from a giant screen above Jobs. Microsoft would invest $150 million in Apple and continue developing Microsoft Office for the Mac. The crowd booed, but Jobs saw the bigger picture. Apple needed software support, credibility, and cash. Pride wouldn't save the company. Strategic alliances would. With stability secured, Jobs turned his attention to design, his true battlefield. In 1998, Apple launched the iMac G3. It was unlike anything the industry had seen. A translucent, candy-colored case. A simple, all-in-one design. A handle on top, as if to say, "This is yours, take it anywhere." The iMac wasn't just a computer, it was a statement. It sold nearly 800,000 units in its first 5 months and put Apple back in the spotlight. But Jobs wasn't satisfied with just saving the company. He wanted to reinvent it. In the early 2000s, Apple expanded into entirely new territory. First came the iPod in 2001, a sleek device that could hold 1,000 songs in your pocket. It revolutionized the way people consumed music and transformed Apple from a computer company into a cultural icon. Then, in 2003, the iTunes Store debuted, making it easy and legal to buy music online for 99 cents a song. Apple wasn't just selling devices, it was building an ecosystem. The momentum kept building. In 2004, the iPod Mini became a sensation. In 2005, the iPod Nano took over. Every new release was a media event, and Jobs had perfected the art of the keynote, the suspense, the reveal, the applause. Apple had gone from a company on life support to one that was dictating the future of technology. But Jobs knew they were just getting started. By 2006, Apple had transformed itself from a struggling computer maker into a cultural force. The iPod was everywhere. The iTunes Store had sold over 1 billion songs. And Steve Jobs, with his black turtleneck and jeans, had become the most recognizable figure in tech. But Jobs was restless. He knew the next big shift was coming, and he intended to lead it. That shift would be the iPhone. Cell phones in 2006 were functional, but uninspired. Small screens, physical keyboards, clunky software. Jobs envisioned something entirely different. A device that combined a phone, a music player, and an internet communicator, all in one. The challenge? No one had ever built anything like it. For over 2 years, a secret team at Apple worked in extreme secrecy. Jobs demanded perfection. The screen had to be large and responsive to touch. The interface had to be intuitive, elegant, and fun. The hardware had to feel premium and timeless. Every detail mattered, down to the rounded corners and the way it felt in the hand. Jobs pushed engineers to the edge. Some nights, people slept in their offices. Some doubted they'd ever meet his expectations. But quitting wasn't an option, not when the reward was changing the world. January 9th, 2007. Macworld San Francisco. Jobs took the stage. He told the audience they were going to see 3 revolutionary products: a widescreen iPod with touch controls, a revolutionary mobile phone, a breakthrough internet communications device. Then, with a mischievous grin, he said, "These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device, and we are calling it iPhone." The crowd erupted. The iPhone was unlike anything on the market. A full touchscreen interface, visual voicemail, desktop-class browsing, a design so sleek it made every other phone look ancient. But the real genius wasn't just in the device. It was in the ecosystem Apple was quietly building around it. A year later, the App Store launched, opening the door for developers worldwide to create software for the iPhone. It transformed the phone into a platform, enabling industries from gaming to ride-sharing to social media to flourish. The iPhone didn't just change Apple. It changed communication, business, entertainment, and culture. It put the internet in everyone's pocket. By 2010, Apple wasn't just a tech company. It was the most valuable company in the world. But as Apple soared to unprecedented heights, Jobs was facing a challenge even he couldn't out-innovate: his health. Years earlier, in 2003, he had been diagnosed with a rare form of pancreatic cancer. He had fought it quietly, even as he continued to lead Apple through its most groundbreaking years. By 2011, his condition was worsening. He began stepping back from daily operations, passing more responsibilities to his trusted team. By 2011, Steve Jobs had become more than a CEO. He was a cultural icon, a symbol of innovation, and the living embodiment of Apple itself. But behind the black turtleneck and calm stage presence, his health was failing. The pancreatic cancer diagnosed in 2003 had returned with a vengeance. Jobs had undergone surgery, alternative treatments, and a liver transplant in 2009, but the disease was relentless. Still, he refused to step away completely. His love for Apple, and for the work of creating insanely great products, kept him coming back. In March 2011, frail but determined, Jobs took the stage to introduce the iPad 2. His voice was softer, his frame was thinner, but the fire was still there. "This is worth it," he told the crowd. "We've been working on this for a long time, and I didn't want to miss today." The audience rose in a standing ovation. They knew they were witnessing something more than a product launch. It was a man giving everything he had left to share his vision. By August 2011, Jobs knew he could no longer lead the company day to day. He resigned as CEO, handing the reins to Tim Cook, his trusted operations chief. In his resignation letter, he wrote, "I believe Apple's brightest and most innovative days are ahead of it." It wasn't a farewell, it was a passing of the torch. Jobs' last public appearance came on October 4th, 2011, at Apple's Cupertino headquarters. He wasn't on stage. Instead, he was in the audience, watching as Cook and the team unveiled the iPhone 4S. The very next day, October 5th, 2011, Steve Jobs passed away at the age of 56. The news broke around the world like a shockwave. People gathered outside Apple stores, leaving flowers, notes, and candles. Heads of state, CEOs, artists, and millions of ordinary people shared what Jobs had meant to them. Bill Gates, his former rival, wrote, "Steve and I first met nearly 30 years ago and have been colleagues, competitors, and friends over the course of more than half our lives. The world rarely sees someone who has had the profound impact Steve has had, the effects of which will be felt for many generations to come." President Barack Obama called him brave enough to think differently, bold enough to believe he could change the world, and talented enough to do it. Jobs left behind not just a company, but a philosophy. Technology should be simple, beautiful, and deeply connected to the human experience. When Steve Jobs passed away in October 2011, many wondered if Apple could survive without him. Jobs had been the driving force behind the company's most iconic products: the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad. His taste, his perfectionism, and his relentless push for excellence seemed irreplaceable. But Jobs had prepared for this moment. Before stepping down as CEO, he had built a leadership team that shared his values. Tim Cook as CEO, Johnny Ive as Chief Design Officer, and a cadre of engineers, marketers, and designers who had absorbed his way of thinking. He had also left behind a clear set of principles. Focus on making great products above all else. Keep the user experience at the center. Simplify, simplify, simplify. These principles became Apple's compass in the years after his death. In 2014, Apple unveiled the Apple Watch, expanding into wearable technology. It wasn't a product Jobs had overseen, but it bore his influence, a fusion of technology, fashion, and utility. The company also continued refining the iPhone, introducing innovations like Face ID, advanced cameras, and edge-to-edge displays, all with the same attention to detail that Jobs had demanded. Apple's financial success was staggering. In 2018, it became the first publicly traded company to reach a market value of $1 trillion. Just 2 years later, it doubled that. But more than numbers, Jobs' legacy was in the way people interacted with technology. He had made devices that didn't just perform tasks. They inspired creativity, connection, and joy. Jobs' story became a blueprint for entrepreneurs and creators. Start small, think big. Don't be afraid to break the rules. Care deeply about the details. Books, documentaries, and films about his life, including the 2015 film Steve Jobs, kept his story alive for new generations. His Stanford commencement speech from 2005, with its advice to stay hungry, stay foolish, went viral, inspiring millions long after his death. And in Apple's headquarters, the circular, spaceship-like Apple Park, there's a quiet space called the Steve Jobs Theater. Every major product launch begins there, a silent reminder that the company's DNA still carries his imprint. In the end, Steve Jobs' life was not just the story of a man who built a company. It was the story of someone who redefined what was possible. From that quiet high school yearbook photo in 1972, a teenage boy with long hair and a spark in his eyes, to standing on stage unveiling products that would change the world, Jobs never stopped chasing his vision. He believed technology should serve humanity, not the other way around. He insisted that design and function were inseparable, and he proved that the most powerful innovations are born at the intersection of art and science. Jobs taught us that failure is not the opposite of success. It's a step toward it. Being fired from Apple could have ended his story. Instead, it became the turning point that led to Pixar, Next, and the iPhone. His journey reminds us that you don't have to follow the rules everyone else follows. You don't have to wait for permission. You don't have to be the smartest person in the room. You just have to care more, push harder, and never settle. Even now, more than a decade after his passing, his fingerprints are everywhere, in the devices we carry, in the way we communicate, in the belief that a small group of passionate people can change the world. But perhaps his greatest lesson came not from a keynote stage, but from a university podium in 2005, when he told graduates at Stanford, "Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. Don't be trapped by dogma, which is living with the results of other people's thinking. Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice. And most important, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow already know what you truly want to become. Everything else is secondary." Jobs ended that speech with 4 words that have since become immortal: stay hungry, stay foolish. Not a call for recklessness, but a reminder to always remain curious, to keep taking risks, and to never lose that sense of wonder. The same wonder he had as a teenager in that yearbook photo, dreaming of what might be. As the camera lingers one last time on that young face from 1972, we can see it now, the hint of the man he would become, the ideas he would unleash, and the future he would shape. It's a reminder to all of us. The next great innovator, dreamer, or world changer could be looking back at us from a photograph right now. The only question is, will they have the courage to follow their vision, no matter where it leads?